So welcome back to, this will be recording 28B, I believe. And we were talking about the organ systems of the reproductive tract. We have finished the male tract, and we're ready to talk about those parts and those processes that allow the female reproductive tract to function. We already made the contrast. The male makes hundreds of millions to trillions of sperm in short periods of time. The female tract devotes its entire body, the female body devotes 4 weeks to maturing a single follicle containing a single egg. Now, let me modify that a little. It used to be thought it was always single. Now we know there's evidence of multiple maturations per month. It's not that uncommon. But typically the female tract is focused on a single egg produced every month. Now, with this anatomy that's in front of you, you see a kind of one of the suspending loops. So here is the suspensory ligament. Basically, you can imagine at this end up here, it being attached to a pelvic bone. Notice how the ovarian artery and vein are running along it for structural support. Notice that there is a suspensory ligament here that is basically stiffening this connection with the ovary, making sure that it is well supported in its position. There is also this kind of sheet of membrane encasing everything. Now here on the surface of the ovary, all over the surface of the ovary, there will be individual follicles right below the surface. But typically one and only one of them will mature with every ovarian cycle. The end of this uterine tube, the conducting tube down to the uterus, it ends here in the ovarian cavity. The pubic cavity that surrounds this reproductive structure. These fimbriae are fingers, and they sort of wave over the surface of the ovary to the position wherever the egg is released. The uterine tube moves down to the uterus. This is a hollow muscular tube. You'll notice here the ureter's position. This is coming down from the bladder behind it. And here is the uterosacral ligament. Now, we'll see more ligaments in future drawings. But basically, we've got this suspended in here very, very firmly. The lower part of the uterus, the cervix, is an opening leading into the vaginal opening. And the vaginal wall is a muscular wall with goblet cells. Now, this drawing is very, very popular because they want to have one figure that kind of illustrates everything you find in an ovary. And that means that we're going to draw some primordial cells. We're going to draw some enlarging cells. So we will call this region of potential cells the egg nest. Now, notice these are diploid cells. They haven't gone to meiosis yet. And these cells that are all surrounding them, not the egg cells themselves, but all this structural cells, these are all diploid cells as well. So when an egg is biochemically identified as the next in line, it starts to expand. Notice this one is expanded and produced a small opening. Here is what's close to a mature follicle. And that mature follicle contains a large amount of kind of clear liquid. This is the egg cell right here in its supporting tissue. Now, when this is mature, it will, as shown here, it will contact the outer membrane of the ovary and breach, expelling the air and the so-called liquor folliculi, the fluid from within. Now, the egg's going to go on its path, but what's happening here is that this supporting tissue that remains behind is going to dry up and shrink. This is called the corpus luteum. And we mention it because it does dry and shrink and shows the position of a previous ovulation. But it also is continuing in a function by producing some go-round drawing kind of indicates that to some people that cells are actually moving around, and that's not what happens. If the cell that is the next in line is this one here, it goes through all of these illustrated stages in that position where the pointer is, and ovulates in that position, and the corpus luteum shrinks back down in that position. So this is one place where the graphic artists have sometimes created a little confusion. The process of producing the egg is called oogenesis, or ovum production. Oddly enough, it begins before birth. In the differentiation of the organs in the female fetus, not the mother, but the female fetus within her, the eggs that, the cells within that ovary, each ovary, that are going to be potentially can become eggs and go through meiosis, are biochemically committed to that pathway, and they enter the first cell division of meiosis, the first round of division. At the stage they call metaphase, they are arrested, meaning the process of meiosis stops, and it remains stopped until a cycle of fertility identifies that follicle as the next in line. This begins before birth. It is largely inactive through adolescence, but at puberty, we activate and accelerate this cyclical maturation of one oocyte. Now that continues until menopause, and menopause is the term we simply assign to when a female stops ovulating. Oogenesis. Now remember back to the male cycle, we did mitosis and meiosis, and we showed how the chromosomes and genes are distributed. You can apply that thinking to the production of the female gamete and exact half set. Because it is the female gamete, we're going to have 1 through 22 chromosomes and an X, always an X, because females always carry 2 X's. Unlike the spermatogonia, the oogonia complete their mitotic divisions before birth. So here is the stem cell undergoing a division into the oogonium primary oocyte. This is still a diploid cell, but this, where the pointer is the cell that is committed to becoming an egg. Meiosis 1 is different than meiosis 1 in males because, although they do pair and separate, that first division that produces the duplicated 3 chromosome set is unequal. This first small cell gets a full complement of chromosomes, just like in male division. But over here, the bulk of the cytoplasm from the primary oocyte, and by the way, we are producing more cytoplasm as we go. So you'll notice it not only retains all the cytoplasm, it grows. The secondary oocyte is much larger than the primary, and all the organelles and all the resources of the initial cell are not only retained but amplified. Now the first polar body over here, it may decay or it may go ahead and divide again. What we're going to illustrate is if it divides again, the secondary oocyte goes through its second division, producing an even larger cell with a 3 chromosome nucleus, that's the exact half set, and a second polar body. What you see up here is what occurs if the first polar body up here divides. So we have 3 polar bodies, and we have 1 functional egg. Now this is showing actually were rushing on to fertilization. And here's my argument with the artists. Look how large they've drawn that sperm. I think on an actual scale, if you consider the purple circle the size of the oocyte, a very accurate drawing of the sperm, the head of the sperm, would be the size of the pointer right at its boundary. So here's another one of those merry-go-round diagrams from the primordial follicles, what we call the egg nest. There's a primary, secondary, and tertiary follicle showing you the one that is developing and the moment of release or ovulation. Notice that these accessory cells have formed a protective barrier around the actual egg itself. This is called the corona radiata, and it basically is sort of like a friction covering. This cell can't move itself. It's going to bounce down that reproductive tract, and as it happens, these productive cells are going to be cushioning and scraped off. Here's the corpus luteum, and a further stage called the corpus albicans. Now, when you use a light microscope, you search and search for the right picture, but this one's a doozy. This is showing the moment of ovulation right here. So they got to look when it actually breached, and you can see the secondary oocyte here inside the corona radiata, those accessory cells that are protecting it. You can also see the boundary of the overall follicle that contains this secondary oocyte. You see this kind of line, and this is the follicular liquid. Liquid, liquid, liquid. Because liquid represents such a good cushioning device. If you have something inside liquid and you press on it, the pressure goes up, but it basically presses out from the inside on every square micrometer of surface area and distributes that force. Posterior view of the left portion of the uterus shows you those accessory tissues. Here is as we said before, the ligament connection, suspending the uterus here, holding the ovary in place, tying it up here to the pelvic rim. Here is the pathway from the ovary through the uterine tube into the uterine cavity. The blood supply must be very rich, first of all, because there's really quite a bit of tissue. This is a muscular vaginal wall and a muscular uterine cavity, even though it's shrunk down in the absence of a pregnancy. It requires quite a bit of blood supply from the uterine artery and vein, making sure these capillaries are well supplied with blood at all times. The superior view kind of is mindful of a comment I just made about you're going to have good, strong connective tissue holding this up. At the beginning, the uterine is just a small sac, but it's going to accumulate some 20 pounds of fetus and of accessory tissue supporting the development of that fetus. And so that's going to have to be held in place throughout the pregnancy. So we do have here the broad ligament showing a kind of a sheet-like attachment to the surrounding hard tissue. This is the uterosacral ligament going back. The cardinal ligaments, notice how many strong connective tissue pieces. The suspensory ligament holding the ovary up and attaching around the back of the uterus, the round ligament of the uterus, and the urinary bladder here on the side. So plenty of connective tissue is in place, and as the uterus expands, it's going to be tied to that pelvic girdle. Female reproductive system. Primary characteristic is, do you make an egg? But all the secondary characteristics that support the full role are called the secondary system glands. The mammary glands are well known. Mammals is a group of animals that are named because the mother's body had gone through a long period of evolution to modify certain sweat glands so that they produce a different liquid called milk. Mammary glands are these glands, and they give their name to the group mammals. mammalian order. They secrete milk to nourish the infant, and it must be a very successful strategy. Typically, these mammals produce smaller numbers of offspring than the invertebrates. I'm well aware that some mammals do produce very large litters and can reproduce very rapidly, but compared to the insects, it's still relatively a small number. Secreting milk that are controlled by hormones of the reproductive system and of the placenta inside the uterus. Now think about this. This is interesting. Here's an organ made for a specific purpose that may never be used. If a female does not reproduce, she will have no lactation. If a female reproduces and gestation is occurring within her, her body is preparing to produce milk in response to stimulation. It will produce that milk in response to that nursing activity from the offspring, and will cease only when that nursing activity ceases. So it is a period, the reproductive system does have these periods of inactivity. There are fat patents that are deep to the skin of the chest, and a basic pathway from the lobules inside the breast to the ducts leading to the nipple, and basically providing a pathway to the surface. The areola is an area of enhanced skin development around the nipple to reinforce it and to hold it in place. It also makes it more resistant to abrasion than the surrounding skin. So here we see the basic structure on top of the pectoralis major muscle. Here are suspensory ligaments that are basically tying this whole structure to the muscle and suspending it. Here is the fat, and this is fat for padding and for structural integrity, kind of holding these systems apart. Here are the individual lobules connected by ducts that converge on this common pathway, the nipple and areola. This produces a network of pathways leading to the nipple. Interestingly enough, milk production and milk letdown are separately controlled activities. The hormones begin with GnRH in the hypothalamus, but the pulse frequency and the amplitude are very, very different, whereas males pulse this stuff out, and the message is always the same: make a couple more 100 million of sperm. The female work under tight regulation. So even if you are preparing for ovulation, the real telling event later, is the egg fertilized or is it not, is going to basically follow that developmental process and that egg release. So there is a strict timing that is much more elegantly regulated in the female. We do see that there is a feedback response, so that the GnRH to FSH and LH produce estrogen and progesterone development, and they have effects back on the hypothalamus and pituitary. So there's a kind of a complete integration of these glands in producing the female cycle. Whenever possible, go back to cells, go back to the molecule, and kind of see if there's any common elements. One of the things that's been impressed on me in my lifetime is that I'm a boy. My sister says she's a girl, and that's a big, important first thing to know. So it's important what gender you use to identify yourselves. But when you look at the molecule, first of all, we begin from a common element, cholesterol. Most of us only heard about cholesterol because of its association with heart attacks, but in this course we've learned it's in membranes. We've learned that it's used to regulate certain elements of our lipid metabolism. And cholesterol is the beginning substance for the direct synthesis of progesterone. There is a pathway from cholesterol that produces androstenedione, which produces our androgens, and also under the influence of different enzymes produces other estrogens like estrone and estriol. This is a complex pathway. That's why we have the general terms androgens and estrogens. So we have here in our central box, sorry, I have just, here we go. We have progesterone here, testosterone, and dihydrotestosterone, and aromatase, which pulls this onto estradiol. So androgens actually give rise to estradiol, estrogen, and androstenedione to other estrogens. But look at the cholesterol imprint, that 6665 ring configuration. Typically the presence of an oxygen at this position. Sometimes it's double bonded oxygen, sometimes it's OH. Up here, a methyl group on the C double bonded O. Here in OH, OH, and OH. The differences are really minor. The presence of side groups that differ mean that the double bond distribution will change. Here we have one opposite the double bond oxygen. Here we have a conjugated ring of double bonds alternating around. Other than that, these molecules are more similar than they are different. So the great importance we assign to gender difference and the rather important difference that it has in our reproduction really isn't reflected by dramatic differences in what we call our sex hormones molecular structure. 5 functions of estrogen that we can list. It does stimulate bone and muscle growth in the female body, so that with the increase in estrogens with puberty, we do have a growth spurt. But the places where those bones and muscles grow are different in the female than in the male. It does maintain secondary sexual characteristics, so it does affect fat distribution. It does affect body hair distribution. The central nervous system affects the hypothalamus, where sexual drive, as defined in the female, is begun. The functional accessory reproductive glands and organs are maintained by adequate levels of estrogen, and it also initiates the repair and growth of the endometrium. Now, what we're talking about there is that the end of the cycle without fertilization produces a sloughing of the endometrial lining, producing fresh growing tissue. And the growth of that endometrium initiates the next cycle, preparing for the next ovulation and the next potential fertilization. So it is estrogen that initiates that repair and growth cycle. We do see these kinds of diagrams often along a 0 to 28 day time scale, and they're very useful. Gonadotrophic hormone levels showing the increase and the particular peak of the green GnRH. Now that shows just prior to a 14-day peak, halfway, and that is accompanied by a pulse of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone just past the peak of the GnRH. So gonadotrophic hormones, because they're producing activity in the gonads. Follicle stages, we can see the kind of the maturation of the assigned follicle with the development of its opening and ovulation occurring here on day 14 and the subsequent sequencing of the corpus stages down to the albicans. In the ovary, we are seeing a general increase in estrogens in inhibin prior to ovulation, and then a diminishment, a secondary estrogen and inhibin peak around this peak of progesterone. as the influences you can see on suppressing this pulse frequency by progesterone is occurring. If we actually looked at a cross section from day 0, this is when menses, or the basically the sloughing of this rich, spongy tissue is occurring. So you can see the thickness is going from here to here to fresh, solid tissue during the uterine cycle, starting around day 7. The proliferative phase, or cell division and cell differentiation, is re-thickening this and continuing to thicken it through the secretory phase. During this stage, the endometrium is awaiting the arrival of a fertilized egg. The only thing that will continue this thickening of the wall and growth of the uterus, in the absence of that stimulation, implantation and gestation, this border 28-0 then becomes this border, and menses basically tears down this thickened stage and regrows it. There is a very distinct increase in body temperature. This is like 1.3 or maybe 2 degrees Fahrenheit, right around the time of ovulation. Back before our chemical and barrier and spermicide means of controlling conception, a popular method was called the counting method, where the days since the last menses were taken as an indication of when ovulation was occurring. So it turns out that the egg and the sperm are relatively short-lived. We will talk about actual numbers later, but if you're thinking in terms of weeks, you're way off base. It is more like a day to a day and a half that the cell actually is viable and can achieve that fertilization. If it does not, it is resorbed, it dies, and it is then, along with the menses, expelled from the female tract. So we do have this period of around 36-4 that jumps. The reason I mentioned the day counting method is that counting the days can be very useful and effective if the female is extremely regular in her ovulation cycle, but it is not unusual to find a day or 2 days variation. This temperature increase, and by the way, this is a basal body temperature taken anally, is much, much more reliable as a way of tracking the timing of ovulation. Body temperature and hormones are explained here, and with specific references to the changes in that body temperature. When ovulation occurs, the basal body temperature declines. The day after ovulation, temperatures rise, and this leads to what another name, the rhythm method of contraception. Now, sexual function refers to an autonomic system of the nervous system that is regulating reproductive behavior. There is noticeable behavior surrounding copulation or coitus, sexual intercourse, that is aimed at a sexual congress that introduces semen into the female reproductive tract. Female humans are unusual in another way. It is often the case that mammals, animals that are non-human animals, are cyclical in their reproductive behavior, meaning that their ovulation and the possibility of conception is regulated and coordinated with seasons of seasonal food production or mild weather that would enhance the possibility of survival of the offspring. We have devised so many methods of protecting ourselves from the environment that things like cold and hot and wet and dry and season of production and season of want actually no longer affect us. We are culturally and societally sustained by our practices. And as a result, the human female cycles on a constant basis following puberty. Fertility in males. Fertility in males is determined by the number of sperm he produces, the sperm count, and I mentioned two other terms to think about: the sperm longevity. You know, if you take a sperm sample out of the male body and put it in a properly balanced solution, then how long does that sperm survive, and how actively does it swim? Sperm motility and sperm survival. The semen has to be the correct pH, has to have a load of nutrients, and for the male to perform, erection and ejaculation must be coordinated with his activity with the female. Females, that ovarian cycle has to be working correctly and to coordinate properly. Normally, this oocyte movement has to occur on time, and her sexual behavior and receptivity has to coordinate with that ovulation. It's odd that in 28 days you basically have one kind of narrow window of time during which the female actually is eligible for fertilization. The reproductive tract has to allow for the survival and movement of the sperm, and I want to and the fertilization of the oocyte, but I kind of want to point out that this is an opening 24 hours a day, every day of the female's life, so it's protected by acid conditions, it's protected by mucus that's moving and other fluids that are moving down toward the opening. It's protected by the entire innate immune system. The sperm is a foreign cell. It's clearly not a self cell, so the white blood cells that are patrolling that area would actively attack it. Male sexual function does coordinate autonomic function with neural reflexes. Sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous divisions are both involved. So basically, the hyper alertness and the hyper receptiveness and activity at this time might just be a reflection of the fact we're using so many nerves at the same time. The male goes through arousal, mate identification, mate selection, and parasympathetic stimulation over the pelvic nerves are what lead to erection. A male progresses through stages of lubrication, emission, and ejaculation. And the term impotence actually refers to a failure to maintain an erection and be able to complete the sexual act. Female sexual function is parasympathetic stimulation largely, and it does cause her erectile tissues to engorge and also to secrete a cervical mucus that lubricates the vaginal walls, called the greater vestibular glands. Blood vessels in the vaginal walls do fill with blood, and fluid moves from the connective tissues to the vaginal surfaces. Now, what are the effects of aging on this system? We've now done, this is our 11th system, and we've noticed a couple of general things we can say. The rate of cell division declines relative to the rate of cell loss. So growth, division falls behind loss of cells. That means that things become less flexible, repair becomes slower, more connective tissue becomes stiffer, losing elastic tissue, and it's not going to be that much different in the reproductive system. In the female system, the effects of aging lead to the slowing and then the cessation of ovulation. And when ovulation and the menstrual cycle ceases, the female is infertile, and we refer to that stage as menopause. Becomes irregular and ceases around 45 to 55 years. So there is a kind of a programmed loss of fertility in females. It's coordinated with, you'll see a parallel decline in estrogen and progesterone, sharp increase in the production of the so-called gonadotropins, GnRH, FSH, and LH. Estrogen decrease is paralleled by a reduction in the size of the uterus and the breasts, a thinning of the epithelium that occurs all over the body, noticeably affects the urethra and the vagina, and also a decrease in estrogen no longer maintains the same bone density. So as bone density declines, you may reach a critical period of where pores form instead of solid bone, osteoporosis, and the bones become more brittle and fragile. In the male system, these occur gradually, but over a long period of time. I think that in the female system, the commitment to this egg formation is such a dramatic use of the female's resources that in time it just sort of stops sooner. In the male system, I mean, there's actually very little cost to producing hundreds of millions of sperm. So although there is a decline in that function, the appearance of abnormal sperm increases in frequency. The number of sperm that are present and can be obtained in a sperm sample declines. The sperm motility, the number of abnormal sperm, as I said, that you can see in a microscope, goes up. So in general, sperm quality does decline with age. And we do talk about the male climacteric or andropause, are named terms out there, but in fact it is somewhat less regular. We do see that the testosterone begins to kind of more regularly decline after 50 to 60 years old, and the circulating gonadotropins do increase, just like in the female. Sperm production does continue, but sperm quality declines. Sexual activity gradually decreases as the testosterone decreases in the male. Now, human reproduction, using these two organ system structures that we've just gone through, it actually requires support by all the other systems, whereas the reproductive system is going to be affecting the overall anatomy and organ system physiology. There's a reciprocal effect. If you don't have good operation of the other 10 systems, then it's going to have an effect on fertility and on the reproductive system, but especially the digestive system, the hormones, the nervous system. All of those are involved, the nourishment, the regulation of sexual behavior and sexual cycling. The cardiovascular system always is involved with every system, and the urinary system to eliminate nitrogenous wastes. So, good news is we have covered the organs and organ systems and are ready for another break.